Hi there, everyone. I hope you can all hear me and see me. My name is Diana Greenwald. I am the Assistant Curator of the Collection at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and I want to welcome you to this conversation, Shen Wei, Naturing Abstraction, focusing on the visual art and paintings in the Gardner Museum's exhibition, Shen Wei, Painting in Motion, currently on view through June 2021. Before we get this session going, I would like to start with a native land acknowledgement. Although we are virtual today, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I think we also might be having a bit of a technical issue. Apparently people can't see me, although my video is on. So I will continue to be a disembodied voice until we figure that out, and hopefully you will soon be able to see me. Additionally, oh great, now you can all see me. Thank you for giving me that heads up in the chat. Additionally, before we begin, I would like to mention that the Gardner is an inclusive museum that welcomes everyone. All visitors and staff have the right to a safe, respectful experience at the museum. Discrimination or harassment will not be tolerated in any form, either in person or virtually. So some ground rules in that spirit. For this conversation, we've prepared a series of questions for our panelists that will follow with an opportunity for you all to ask questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. With that said, I would like to introduce our three panelists for the evening, and hopefully their videos will pop up as we introduce them. And so I'll start with Nancy Berliner. Nancy Berliner, PhD, is a historian of Chinese art and architecture and is the Wu Tung Senior Curator of Chinese Art at the Museum of Fine Arts right here in Boston. Her current exhibition at the MFA is the Wang Family Collection of Paintings, Friends and Family. It highlights over 200 works of art from the most significant private collection of Chinese paintings in the US. Dr. Berliner completed her undergraduate and graduate studies at Harvard and at the Central Academy of Art in Beijing. Her research, writing, and curatorial work have considered a broad definition of Chinese art, including Chinese architecture, gardens, furniture, as well as popular and vernacular cultures. Prior to the MFA, she was the curator of Chinese art at the Peabody Essex Museum and is the long-term interpretive and curatorial advisor to the World Monuments Fund for Qianlong Garden Conservation Project in the Forbidden City in Beijing. Our next panelist, Karen Won, is the Deputy Director of Curatorial Programs at the NTU Center for Contemporary Art, Singapore. She received her PhD in the History, Theory, and Criticism of Art and Architecture from MIT. A global modernist, she has recently focused on curatorial projects that explore transmediatic, transcultural, and transhistorical discourse. One is the curator of the forthcoming exhibition Team Lab, Continuity, at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco, where she was a curator from 2015 to 2019. Prior to her time in San Francisco, she was a curator at the Crow Museum of Asian Art in Dallas, Texas, a museum educator for Asian art at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, and oversaw the curatorial program Artist Residencies and Artist in Industry program at Artworks in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Last but not least, Purana Cavalchini is the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum's Tom and Lisa Blumenthal Curator of Contemporary Art, where she has organized over 33 exhibitions and produced many artist books. For the museum's centennial in 2003, she curated a three-part project with Joseph Kasuth. Other artists she has worked with include Hamra Abbas, Sophie Kahl, Cliff Evans, Joan Jonas, Louisa Lombry, Steve Locke, Jean-Michel Othoniel, Adam Pendleton, the Rax Media Collective, Dianita Singh, and Lauren Owens. Cavalcini also oversees the museum's Artist in Residence program, which, during her tenure, has hosted 55 visual artists from around the world, working in a wide range of disciplines, from actors to composers, filmmakers, poets, storytellers, and writers. Prior to joining the Gardner, Cavalcini served as a special advisor to the Incontri Internazionale d'Arte in Rome and as coordinator for the Concerti di Mezzogiorno at the Festival of Two Worlds of Spoleto. In 2018, she was honored with the Chevalier d'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres of France. Quite the series of panelists we have today, which I'm very excited about. So without further ado, I will go ahead and kick off with our first question. And so the last thing I should have said, of course, is also Purana is the curator of the show, Shen Wei Painting in Motion, which is also why she's joining us. So I want to start with a little bit of historical context about Shen Wei and his particular background as someone born in the late 1960s during Mao's Cultural Revolution, who came of age as China opened to the world after Mao's death, and ultimately worked internationally with home bases in the United States and Europe. How have these different geographic and cultural contexts affected Shen Wei and other artists of his generation? How did his particular training in Chinese opera at this moment inform his artistic practice? And Karin, I know this is something that you have worked on extensively, so I wonder if you could be the first one to field this question.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you to the Gardner Museum for convening us here. And specifically, thank you to Purana for helping me with my research many years ago that was, exactly on this time period. And in that case, related to the work of Zhang Pei Li, who was using the environment at the Gardner for his residency and for, a series of projects that I think is important to think about, where there's a lot of overlap between work that happened during this very formative period in Chinese history in the sort of reform era. The mid 80s going into the sort of late 80s and early 90s was this really, really critical period for artists who came of age, as Diana mentioned, sort of in broad strokes, sort of, during the Cultural Revolution, but then very much became part of an active intellectual and cultural sort of, sometimes it's been called a reawakening, and sometimes it's been called a sort of initial publishing in terms of how these different initiatives were very much sort of self-initiated. Artists were coming together and forming collectives, publishing, and that work, continues to inform work that's happening today. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind in terms of this. This period has quite an impact on the present. And with somebody like Shen Wei, I think his work and development, as a dancer, as a choreographer, and also as an artist, have always been intertwined for him. And it has a lot to do with this period, in the mid to late 80s, when it was possible to, study one thing. And, at this point, the academic infrastructure in China, was sort of reopened and, very much sort of alive. Those who, gained entrance to these very sort of elite places for training had the sort of traditional or, very set curriculum available to them, and they tended to have a fairly rigorous experience there. But then there was also this entire sort of extracurricular or co-curricular sort of mentality that many people, took it upon themselves to do outside reading, to organize reading groups, various other types of ways of convening. So I had the privilege of, visiting with Shen Wei in his studio many years ago and seeing, some of his sort of, you might call it sort of experimental or almost student work, painting that looks very much like cynical realism and things that were happening at the time that had nothing to do with his training in the performing arts or specifically with Chinese opera, but the idea that that wasn't sort of a limiting factor to exploring something else or exploring philosophy or exploring a completely sort of transdisciplinary approach to developing his own voice as an artist.
I'm muted. Nancy, I know you also, I know the travails of Zoom, we're all learning. I know you also spent time in China sort of as this generation was coming of age. Do you have something to add sort of about this moment in the history of Chinese art and how it informs contemporary practice now?
Yeah, I was at the Central Academy of Art in Beijing in the early 80s. So it was just the same time period when he was studying and in college and developing. And I remember, for instance, whenever an issue of Art Forum or some American or European art magazine arrived, everybody would rush to see it and it would get passed all around. So it was this very exciting moment when suddenly information about international art was coming into China and people were just experimenting and doing all sorts of things. It was actually the same time period when the MFA sent a collection of American art to China. That was the first time American art had gone to China. And the exhibition included abstract expressionist paintings. There was a Jackson Pollock painting. So it was just a very exciting moment when China had just opened up and people were thinking in many different directions. But at the same time, Shen Wei had this wonderful experience of training in traditional Chinese opera, which, just gave him an incredible control over his body and his voice. And I think he also studied calligraphy as a child with his father. And so he also had that discipline and that skill that he could take in so many different directions.
That's fantastic and a perfect segue to our next question, which I also was going to direct towards you. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit further about situating Shen Wei's work in the context of a range of Chinese artistic traditions, particularly Chinese calligraphy and painting. And I know we have some visuals that we're going to pull up. And these are also described in the catalog, a plug for a fantastic publication. So for example, there are comparisons drawn between Shen Wei's painting series Reflecting Elements, one of which we see here, and images of mountains from the Northern Song Dynasty. Also, his work Movement number 5, number 6, and Calligraphy of the same period. So what connections do you see between Shen Wei and historic Chinese art, both from the Northern Song Dynasty and other periods in Chinese art?
So the painting that you first showed there on the left was a painting by Guo Xi from the 11th century, probably one of the most famous paintings in Chinese history. And I'm sure when Shen Wei was first learning about Chinese painting, he would have seen this painting and many others with this very typical Northern Song, so 11th, 12th century composition with these very high monumental mountains and then something in the foreground. And you can see how these compositions are so similar. But there's another real tie that I see between Shen Wei and calligraphy. I remember when I was at art school in Beijing, I asked somebody to please give me a description of what exactly calligraphy was. And they said that the only thing in European and American art that you could really compare calligraphy to was dance. And because when we look at calligraphy, the American or European eye might see lines on paper, black lines on paper. But the Chinese eye actually sees the movement of the brush, the movement of the body and the arm. And that what we see on the paper is just kind of a leftover remnant of the movement. And when a Chinese person who's fluent in calligraphy looks at a work, they actually, they know the order of the brush strokes. There's a specific sequence of brush strokes. So they look at the calligraphy and they don't just say, oh, that means such and such. They actually trace it out in their mind. So in their mind, they're repeating the movement of the arm of the artist. And so when I see Shen Wei's dance work, it just reminds me of calligraphy, particularly the works where the dancers are leaving traces on the floor surface. So it just combines beautifully. It's a wonderful tie between modern dance and calligraphy.
That's fantastic. Karin, Purana, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, sort of situating Shen Wei in these traditional Chinese arts, or an updating of them?
Actually, I guess I know that we need to think about a few other aspects of Shen Wei's practice as well, but I really do appreciate that we're sort of taking the time to situate him historically, not just thinking about, his relationship to sort of Chinese art and other elements of Chinese culture as part of, not even just his formal education, but informal education. But also, very much something that he's taken on as self-study, even after leaving China. So he spent, quite some interesting time in Guangzhou and Guangdong, and I believe he was part of the modern dance troupe there. But then, after leaving China in 1994, he's continued to sort of study and, very much, attempt to become more fluent in, I think, this language of historical painting and the language of calligraphy. So even from New York or, elsewhere in the world, that's been, very much a part of his life in, this sort of globalized contemporary art context.
What I was thinking of was this idea of universal life energy. Shen Wei has told me that calligraphy has the qi through the brushstroke, which is what you were saying, Nancy, this idea, and that qi, that breath, is also in the dance practice. So there is that sense of a similar energy flow, and the qi is in his paintings, and it's the way he approaches his paintings too. So I was thinking, as you have this slide up of the Olympics of the scroll painting, where the dancers were using mitts to paint, and it was also a multimedia piece, so it's quite complex, and at the end the painting rises up. But I also was thinking these dancers remind me of a flock of birds, and this incredible energy, the fact that he created this calligraphy form, the scroll, and then juxtapose modern dance on it. Because modern dance, I mean, the first dance group, the first dance of which he was part, he was a co-founder, was in the 90s. I mean, it's really quite, it happened in the 90s. So modern dance, I don't know how vast the knowledge of modern dance is throughout China. So I think this piece was an incredible, spectacular moment of uniting this ancient scroll form with a very contemporary movement.
That's great. Well, thank you for that, Purana. And I'm gonna, well, I should let our panelists, if they have another thought before we move on to our next question. But I think Nancy, do you have something to add, or should we?
I did want to add one little other thing, which is that sometimes when people in China or in Chinese art world are talking about paintings in Chinese, instead of saying they're looking at a painting, they say they're reading a painting, or they instead of painting a painting, they say they're writing a painting. So writing and reading are things that happen sequentially, right? And not just looking at one composition. And in some of Shen Wei's paintings, particularly the very wide ones, I very much feel like I am reading the painting through time, and that there are various activities happening in one corner and some other relationships happening in another corner, and that one reads it just as he might have written the painting.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So thinking about Shen Wei in quite an immediate context, in the sense of the context of the Gardner Museum. He's visited the museum several times since 2017 as an artist in residence to create his film Passion Spirit and to explore the Gardner's collection and our historic art collection. And I think we have a short clip that we're going to show of this, and then after that we'll sort of reconvene, as it were, and I'll pose a couple more questions to our panelists. Okay, fantastic. If we just move to the next slide, great. I wanted to ask this next question sort of over these two comparable images. On the left, we have Auspicious Cranes, which of course is a work, it is a Chinese scroll from the Song Dynasty, and that made an appearance in the film. And on the right, we actually have a Pierre Mateo from the Gardner's collection, which also made an appearance in the film. Kind of a wonderful juxtaposition. And so, and a connection of two different traditions. And I'll first talk to Purana, who worked with Shen Wei while he was at the Gardner. Can you talk a little bit about how the collection, how the Gardner Museum influenced the work that he made during his residency and the connections that you see from that residency to what people will see in the exhibition? And you are muted, Purana, which is again.
Sorry about that. Well, I was saying Shen Wei has said that staying at the Gardner, visiting the museum collection, made him think of being on a journey through human history and culture and art and passion. And, you know, when he came in 2018, he was really, you know, working, kind of preparing his Shanghai exhibition survey and working on the catalog. And we set up a painting studio for him in the apartment. And he spent a lot of time in the collection and painting. And one of the things that happened during that visit was he went on a flashlight tour where I think he had a eureka moment. It's a special treat, the flashlight tour that AIR's artists in residence do. And at night, you know, the museum is dark, and walking through the quiet galleries with a flashlight brings to life, you know, all the gold, the portraits, the fabrics become resplendent, and it's very silent. And I think the flashlight tour really made him want to make Passion Spirit, because in the film he captures how natural light shines through the windows. And the window panes become like clouds in the sky of these paintings. I mean, you can really see the connection. He shows how natural light plays a role in bringing life to historic artwork and how everything is somehow connected. And in this particular piece, you know, in the clip, you see that the film is driven by this dancer, and the clip that we showed you was kind of the end of the film, where because actually right at the beginning, the figure almost steps out of the Piero Matteo's D'Amelia's Annunciation in the Raphael room. And the camera kind of glides through the gallery corridor in the painting to the garden at the end, you see, and then pans into the connector of the museum. And it's wonderful how Shen Wei plays with the beautiful sense of space in the Renaissance painting and connects it to courtyard garden that way. And this dancer is always carrying a little red book. And towards the end, she lies on the grass, which is what we showed you. And you discover that in the red book, there's this crane, which comes from Auspicious Crane, of this famous painting, Auspicious Cranes. That's a Chinese painting. So it was wonderful how he creates movement through the building and kind of juxtaposes it to the space of a Renaissance painting, and then pulls in this crane painting, of which I really don't know that much. I'd love to know more. I don't know if either of you would like to speak to that particular painting.
It was done by the emperor.
Really?
Yeah, who was a wonderful artist and an art lover and art collector, and was so passionate about art that unfortunately he didn't pay enough attention to what was going on politically, and he was overthrown and lost lost his reign, taken over by the a tribe coming down from the north. So all of northern China, which is why they call it the Northern Song, because the Northern Song was lost and they moved to southern China and became the Southern Song. But he actually died in captivity. He was taken captive by the foreigners who took over. So.
I love the Shen Wei loves this painting. He's really
passionate. Oh, it's wonderful. And I can understand why he loves it, because as he said, the birds are like dancers.
Yeah, it makes me think, it connects it to the scroll painting of the Olympics. It's just this movement. It's as if he was talking to that painting in that piece.
Yeah. And the cranes are symbols of longevity. So they're auspicious.
That's fantastic. And this actually is kind of, again, speaking to this multidisciplinarity of Shen Wei. This is another good transition. His work bridges, and here we have, again, two wonderful examples, across painting, calligraphy, choreography, dance, and film. So I wonder if we talked a little bit about this in the first question, but I wonder maybe if Karin in particular, could you help us understand how this multidisciplinary practice and engagement with a range of media is unique to Shen Wei, or is it something that we see in a range of contemporary Chinese artistic practice? Help us understand his uniqueness in this way, or how he's part of a cohort.
Sure. I think it probably goes without saying that, Shen Wei is just a very unique individual. He's, very distinctive, as a choreographer who has also, developed, essentially his own technique of developing and working with the body, and with, having his dancers have a very sort of different approach to understanding their own physicality. This is not sort of, a standard way of approaching, dance. And so I feel like this is kind of the nuance that he brings to the different art forms that he looks into, is that, he sort of, receives and studies tradition in a very sort of directed and sort of particular way, but then is also very sort of able to open it up and sort of create a way to make these things his own. And so I think that, as I had mentioned, there is this kind of interesting period in the 80s and the 90s where, there is this, sort of embracing of, transdisciplinarity, the encouragement of experimentation, but, in many ways it took the form of, collectives who were able to kind of articulate manifestos And, in some cases there was a style that, became a particularly interesting way of approaching, sort of art and aesthetics. And in that case, I feel like Shen Wei's sort of approach to multidisciplinarity is actually much, much broader. Than that he wasn't necessarily trying to be a part of anything. He was trying to kind of see broad connections in a way that has, formed the basis of new work. And I think that's always the goal for him, is to really sort of translate these things that he's thinking about and looking at into new work, rather than necessarily trying to be in conversation with other artists and, in other media. So while the kind of spirit of experimentation and transmediatic sort of, I guess the environment of transmediatic practice is very much something that's common, in sort of the Chinese cultural sphere in the contemporary era. It's always his own take that sort of, takes the work in these very interesting directions. And especially seeing how he's increasingly found ways to merge his sort of visual art practice with the performing arts world is very exciting.
Great, thank you. So, Fiorana, you wrote a wonderful essay about Shen Wei's notebooks, and I think we have an image, these fabulous drawers that are in the exhibition. And he which he uses to document possible choreography, performance ideas, preliminary artwork sketches, and as well as his extensive travels. The way that you put it in the catalog, these notebooks, quote, reinforce his desire to evolve and push towards the new, end quote, sort of what Karin was just referring to. Do you see Shen Wei as an artist who is primarily focused on process, sort of on the means of getting to a work rather than the form of the finished work itself? In short, is the pathway to the creation of a work and the self-reflection and self-mastery that entails more important than what ends up recorded on canvas or video? And again, how can we sort of contextualize this? And I know he focuses on meditative processes quite a bit in his own choreography and even just as a person. So how can we also contextualize that in those sort of meditative traditions? Sorry, that's quite a loaded question.
I think both are true. I think process is central to his dance and his painting practice. As you said, he's always focusing on new discoveries, on pushing limits and boundaries and new ways of looking at the world. It's like a spiritual journey at the same time. And the notebooks are a place in which he returns constantly to work out and experiment new ideas, so it's always movement. But then he's also a perfectionist. So, like, for instance, if you take Passion Spirit, he meticulously fine-tuned every single frame of that film. And he's constantly working again and again on his paintings, working to make them better. For instance, Suspension in Blue, there were 4 paintings in that series. We're showing 2 in the exhibition that were shown in Shanghai. And by the time they came to Boston, he spent a year in Paris working on them further. And they're amazing. They've really changed and have become more focused. And it's so. I think creativity for him means extreme focus, often to the point of exhaustion. His painting is a deeply meditative practice. I think it expresses his spiritual journey and his belief that everything in nature and human experience and the spiritual world are somehow connected. Those drawers are filled with these notebooks, and that one in particular shows, the different designs, because he's not just a choreographer, but he also is basically a producer. He creates the sets, he creates the costumes, and he's been doing this way from the beginning. And the drawers are interesting because they do sort of show the different ways of how he's looking at movement, the new way of thinking about dance, which as Karen said, is really unique. I mean, yeah. It's interesting. These books are really interesting. They illustrate how dance, which is really a time-based medium, can be annotated on a page. I mean, you could spend a lot of time with those books and drawings. So I think it's both. I think he's super interested in process, but he's also a perfectionist. And the final outcome is important to him.
Sounds quite intensive, I'll be honest, to be both a perfectionist and obsessed with process.
He's like two people, because on the one hand, as a dancer choreographer, it's all about teamwork. And then as a painter, he's like a loner. He's really focused. I mean, it's this, he's both. It's interesting.
And maybe this is sort of a follow-up perhaps for Nancy. Is this sort of dual perfectionism yet meditative process element of Shen Wei's art something that you would say characterizes, for example, maybe calligraphy, or is there this dual mission towards really focusing on the process of the moment, but also with an eye towards a perfect finished product? Is part of that a part of a longer cultural tradition? Or is Shen Wei just, particularly has particularly high standards?
He's definitely unique. But one thing that's interesting is that if you're painting a Chinese painting or doing a piece of calligraphy, once you make a mark on a piece of paper with ink, that's it. It's there. It's permanent. You can't change it. And so you just have to work with what you have created. And it's fascinating to me that he works on these paintings and he displays them and then he takes them back and then he continues to work on them, perfecting and re-perfecting, so that the object becomes an ever-evolving object. Whereas many Chinese artists, if they're working on a large composition, for instance, they might do it once and it's not quite right, so they do it again. So they might do 5, 10 drafts of the painting over and over and over until they feel like they have it right, and the others are just drafts. But he's a remarkable artist. He's remarkable in that he works in so many mediums and he is so disciplined and is able not just to work in these mediums separated, but brings them all together. It's really masterful.
That's great. That's fantastic. And if it's all right with our panelists, I'll actually start transitioning to some audience questions. And this is also a moment where I should tell everyone to put their questions into the Q&A box. So we have one question to kick us off, and it was Shen Wei inspired to greatness by any particular family member, any particular family members? So this is sort of a biographical question. I don't know who among you would like to field that.
What I know is that his father was, was involved with an opera company and was also a calligrapher and is still a calligrapher. And his brother as well works in calligraphy. So there's a tradition in his family for painting, for calligraphy, for the visual arts. That's
great. Thank you. And I'll just add another biographical question. I'm also thinking Piranha's going to have this. How old is Shen Wei? This is another question that just came up.
He turned 50 this year.
50 this year. Okay, great. And then I have another question that I think any of you could maybe talk about, although again, I think Piranha, given that you've been in touch with the artist pretty regularly, I have a question about Shen Wei today, sort of wondering about his reactions to the traumas of our time right now, I assume in the context of the pandemic and social upheaval, and how has he reacted to those traumas.
Well, Shen Wei's in China right now, so he left in August. The pandemic had already been raging, but there was that moment when people could travel, and he went back home. I think, especially because he hadn't seen his parents in a long time, and his father, and they had gone through the pandemic fully because they were isolated with the 60 million who were stuck in one place for a long period of time. So he went back to see his family. But then during this period, I think he's really been doing a lot of research, thinking about new projects, looking at traditions. I mean, he's really probably, like a lot of artists, once this is over, is going to really create, come out with a whole new body of work. A lot of artists have done this. They've really steeped themselves in their archives and it'll be really, I think there's going to be a renaissance after the pandemic is over, all over the world.
So I have another question that I think, maybe Nancy and Karin can also help us out with. So can we talk a little bit more about the influence of abstract expressionism on Shen Wei? And what our audience members said, it seems fairly evident to their eye. So what's that interplay between Shen Wei's work and abstract expressionism?
I think the Chinese in some ways created abstract expressionism over 1,000 years ago, when they started emphasizing expression in art, that expression came out through a brushstroke, that naturalism, realism was not at all important. Even color was not important, that it was just the brushstroke. And the appreciation of the texture and the pressure that you can see in the brushstroke, and that it expressed the human insides through form. So
yeah, maybe to add to that, I think that that has a lot to do with Shen Wei's approach, which is, of course, he's, very familiar with abstract expressionist painting in the sort of, American New York school tradition, which was also, very actively kind of exported in the post-war period from the point of view of US sort of, endorsing the idea of the sort of freedom of expression and sort of other types of freedom that could be kind of read into abstract expressionist painting, very much an overt sort of soft diplomacy. So while he's, very, very familiar with the sort of ethos and the techniques, I think it's also important to understand that I think he came to it in, a very genuine way by sort of being physically connected, to the materials, he enjoys the material of ink, but I think he equally enjoys the material of sort of more viscous paints and seeing the sort of sculptural aspect of how they're, sort of applied, how they change, how, as some of you who have spent time with the works in the gallery, you might sort of wonder, is that actually dry? Would it ever actually dry? Because it has this sort of, sort of
point.
Yeah.
Actually, it's not.
Mountainous quality in some places, or how it's applied, and I think that also has to do with Shen Wei genuinely experiencing and expressing things. So I'm thinking particularly of his real love of nature and spending time in nature, and he's obviously been sort of decorated with sort of accolade that one could hope for in the arts and cultural world, and yet he doesn't get hung up on his sort of achievements or on necessarily being part of of a sort of exclusively sort of cultural or sort of man-made world. He spends a lot of time sort of, as Pirana mentioned, part of his process for painting is fairly solitary, but he also always makes it a point to travel on his own and to spend time in nature on his own. And one of the most enjoyable conversations that I had with him was just spending lots of time with his paintings, where we were essentially finding more or less animal shapes in the abstraction and the talking about how much we love animals. And other natural forms, and that there's just this delight and interest in how, you know, these sort of the abstraction embedded in the work is also very much connected to a type of, you know, abstraction that's actually in the world, in nature, that we can all see and feel and relate to, no matter where we're from.
That's fantastic. I have what I think, based on my schedule, might be our last question from the audience, but it's one that I find personally really intriguing, also as an art historian. How important is scale to Shen Wei's work? So it's sort of interesting, as we have everything from these tiny notebooks to a film where he's taken over the palace of the Gardner, to one of the largest works on canvas, if we come to the museum, that I've seen in person. So can we talk about how important scale is to his work? It's probably a hard question.
I think it's important to all works, you know, to understand an object scale, and how we as human beings relate to that object. You know, holding something small in your hand and having a very intimate relationship is very different than looking at a work that is 10 feet high.
I think the size of the paintings in the show allow visitors to feel that you're entering like into a dreamscape.
Yeah.
It's like this dreamscape is in constant flux, and there's no end to the spiritual journey, and you approach it and you recede from it, and it shifts and changes, or you walk along it and it's like a landscape. I don't know, it's these paintings in the show are I think the scale has an impact, especially because it's in a big room and there's lots of space, which, by the way, with all of us not having much space, it's really nice to spend time in the room and just enjoy that sense of space around the paintings and your body and moving with them. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it says a lot for Shen Wei as an artist that he is sort of simultaneously able to, you know, really master scale, you know, in this way that he, you know, we were looking at the Beijing Olympic opening ceremony, which is, you know, just this extremely large scale, you know, manipulation of, you know, both the sort of performative elements and, you know, essentially the live creation of an ink painting, but that his work is also just in all of these different forms imbued with a real subtlety that, you know, that I feel like gesture and sort of intention, you know, whether it's, you know, sort of the subtle look of one of his dancers, you know, 30 degrees this way versus 30 degrees this way, or the sort of, you know, subtle application of, you know, color or a line in his work, that there's this way that he's able to kind of balance the two that's really quite beautiful and quite captivating. And I do hope that everyone who's joining us virtually today has gotten to or will get to spend time with the work, and, you know, in these gallery spaces where it's a sort of special way to come together, you know, with the work and with the context of the Gardner and its beautiful collection.
Gosh, Karin, you're doing my job for me as a moderator. Sorry, Nancy, were you going to say something?
that enjoying them and being in the physical space with the paintings is so entirely different than, sadly, you know, just a virtual look, or even in a book, because in the book you can't be encompassed by the atmosphere that he creates.
Which is a perfect segue to point out that we are, again, open. So for those who feel comfortable, we would love to welcome you to the museum. I feel, in a way, our panelists have already answered what was supposed to be my final question, which is what should people expect when they walk into the exhibition? But Kirana, would you like to add anything else about what people should expect if they are able and willing to come join us at the museum and see the exhibition?
I think it was so nicely said by Karen. I think it's really it's a magical moment because you see this artist who explores this intersection between cultures and art forms to express his own spiritual journey and his belief that human experience and things in nature are connected, and you can join him with your own visual and spiritual journey. So, and it's a good thing. It's really recentering and meditative, and I think it's maybe what people need right now.
Absolutely. So with that, I would like to thank our wonderful panelists for participating in this conversation. Thank you to our audience members for your fantastic questions and your time. I believe there are going to be a series of links that are going to be shared in the chat that include a link to the fantastic catalog for this show, as well as a link to book time tickets to see the show. As a reminder, Shen Wei Painting in Motion will be open through June 20th, 2021. So we have plenty, you have a good chunk of time to get in. I hope you will. And otherwise, I'll just say, have a great evening. Keep an eye out for our future digital programs. And thank you again to everyone who joined us.
Thank you, Diana. You've been great.
Thank you, Diana.
All right.
Thank you for putting everything together. It's beautiful.